Hello everybody, I was super excited to bring you that video tutorial because in this one I would like to explain you how to paint non-metallic metals and other stuff in different ways. What happens when we understand the OSL, the magic lighting, light search everywhere, something crazy, and we want to represent non-metallic metals or other materials that could be complex at the beginning. So if you see, now for this bra or this kind of armor, I would like to paint that non-metallic metal in different ways. Remember that we painted with 3 different lightings. One from one OSL with green or yellow light from her back. Another one with a red color from the bottom side. And then another one more or less in the center of her. So what happens when we have to represent a material that should reflect that kind of lighting? We have to understand that instead of painting with the color that we have in our minds, with, for example, other kind of bluish or other colors that you have on your mind, we have to think, okay, what kind of environment I have now? Because the most important now, the main light will be this red color. So this is the reason why I've decided to start with a really dark color. Don't worry the color, the most important will be the desaturation. So if it's near of gray or black, will be better than if you use another kind of color. So it's like removing the soul of this color. Just a desaturated color, darker will be okay. Then if you see, I'm painting the light effect. So with this kind of red colors, I'm going to paint more or less the non-metallic metal. At the beginning there, because after that, I'm going to paint with other kind of colors that later I'm going to explain you with more contrast or less depending about this OSL. So this OSL should be the main light. So never should be less important than the rest of the non-metallic metal. So the other lighting should be part of this, but not better or the most important. So that effect could give us the feeling that for sure the lighting is coming from the bottom, and this is a perfect place for the material to represent that reflection. So this is why I've decided to paint at the beginning with a more or less cold and darker red, and then painting with something higher, because with these highlights I'm going to increase the effect about the non-metallic metal. Instead of thinking about white or grays or colors similar like that, I've decided to change that theory about the color just using red tonalities to represent better the reflection from the light touching that material. Always talking about different kind of reds. If you want, you can play, for example, with more oranges or more yellows or more magentas, something like that. Always talking that you have to create variations, shades inside of this red. Not talking about oranges, yellows, magentas in general. So it's like using that kind of colors inside of your mixes to increase the tonalities. In my case, I've decided to use that kind of colors because I thought that could be perfect for my environment, for that vampire, and I've decided to use this one. If you want to use something different, in my opinion, magenta is the primary color, the real red color. So this one will be a perfect choice always. Then you have to choose something with more yellow for sure to get the red that you have in your mind. But what happens if you use oranges? Maybe with oranges you will have better control than if you use yellow. Because if you have magenta plus oranges, then you will have more different kind of reds. But maybe if you add yellow, maybe you will have something more close of orange than red. So it's just a trick to control it. Once time we have the effect about the non-metallic metal on that side, it's time to go to the other side. And in this one, it's in the place where I'm going to create better the feeling that the normal non-metallic metal with different gradients about grayscale. But in that case, if you see my wet palette, I'm painting with green. Why? Because it's the complementary color about this red will be perfect to represent the non-metallic metal instead of blue or other colors. Green will be perfect too because it's colder, and the complementary color. So I'm going to get double contrast. But if you see at the beginning, I'm painting with, for example, if you think that this is gray plus green, it's perfect too. But if you think that this kind of green but desaturated, it's the same. So it's perfect too. Because later with the next highlightings, you will see how I'm going to loosen that saturation. So at the end, we look more like gray without colors. But at the beginning, the base coats, the first highlightings will have green inside. So will be perfect to get that contrast. Without using a high value, I'm using a high contrast, just talking about the color. So this is another trick to represent that kind of effects. If you see, one time I've painted some highlightings with capibases with that texture, I can add some glazing with the dilution that I explain you always with a 50% to blend more or less on that texture and keep another different area to continue working inside. Because the most important is using the perfect color for the shadows. Doesn't make sense using the previous base coat, so that kind of black or really dark color, near of the highest highlighting. At least if you don't want to create damage or something similar. If you want to create shades or shapes, I recommend you always blend a bit with that kind of effect. It's like a glazing, but with a 50%. It's like a base coat for everyone, but for me, it's my kind of glazing. And then always with capibases, as you can see, just with one brush stroke, I can draw the edge highlighting, I can draw the texture how I like it. Everything with just a single layer. If you want to paint with 2 single layers, a bit thinner, will be perfect too. But be careful, try to paint with 1 or 2 layers instead of 20 because you will waste your time. It's the reason why I paint in that way, because later when I build it, everything, it's when I like to add this kind of blending. And between every layer, we can do it. So this is the perfect effect to do it. And if you see then with the highlighting, I've painted more or less with the first 2 or 3 layers everywhere without care about the shape or without care about the highlighting or the environment. And then with the 3rd, 4th and next layers, I'm going to think about the shape or I'm going to think about where the light is touching that area or something. Like you can see, in that case, I've decided to painting in the way to represent the material. So this is how you can see that I cross the cap with that kind of highlightings, something higher to get higher contrast to represent the non-metallic metal. But if you see, will be just in a single point or just few points, because my idea is keep the green tonalities more or less in general to have that double contrast with the complementary colors and with the temperature. If you see, the red color will be warmer than the green color, and then the green color will be the complementary color for that red color. And then on the green color, I'm going to cross the cap that I made it on the red area. So I'm going to create another contrast. So I have 3 different contrasts in the same place. This is how it looks with more contrast than if we paint just with a single one, like going with the darkest red, for example, to the brightest red. Will be a high contrast for sure, but just a single one. That process I'm going to repeat more or less everywhere in general. For that bracelet I've painted or I made it, I've decided to paint exactly the same, painting with that kind of greens inside of that gray. Why? The same way, to get the double contrast with the complementary colors. In that case, it's the pen should be more suggestive. We can talk more about this topic because what kind of colors I use for her skin. She has more red, more magentas, more oranges. It's depend of that kind of colors. We can talk about another color should be the perfect complementary. But in my case, this one could work exactly in the same way that if I use blue. But because I use that kind of green on the other side and I like to represent more or less similar material, I've decided to start with the similar or the same color, just to get a similar product, a similar material. If we change, for example, if we paint silver everywhere and we paint every silver completely different, maybe it will be hard. When I explain you that you have to change always a bit every material means every materials. If you want to paint exactly the same material, you can get some shades, nuances, but starting with the same colors because the material is the same. So then at the end, maybe we'll change for the environment, for some light reflections, for something. But at the beginning, if you start with a similar color, will be perfect. If you see in this one, I've decided to use on the bottom side with that green or yellow color to represent the environment from the other side. Instead of using red, I've decided to use the other color. So more or less, this is the idea. When we think about this non-metallic metal and we are playing with that kind of environment, it's really important to think what kind of colors I have there. For example, now that with that kind of skull, I have the option to think or to choose what kind of material is this one. Another kind of steel, another kind of jewelry, or in my opinion, something more like a stone. Why? Just because I like it. I've decided to create something different or like a real skull with horns or something made it. But for example, made it with stone or something similar. And was the reason just because the other side of the crown, I've decided to paint with non-metallic. If everything have the same material, maybe it will be boring. So this is the reason why I've decided to play with different contrasts to represent some materials higher than others. Everything together will give you the feeling that each material is completely different than the other one. So this is the idea when I thought about that model. Try to represent everything in more or less gray scale, talking about the materials, about the every detail, not about her skin for sure, or the other two colors. And then with the other two colors, with the other two highlightings, that yellow and red, or green and red, I've decided to increase more the saturation as I can. Why? Just because I like it. Just that. The reason was always the same. Try to give you something interesting to paint, something beautiful to watch, something that could hook you. Because always we have to paint for ourselves and always to paint something beautiful. Don't think about the realistic, because this is a vampire. Okay, maybe you think that vampire is a sixth, maybe, or maybe not, but for sure, because it's something from the fantasy, we can get everything as we have on our mind. We can get more random or static effects instead of realistic effects. Sometimes, if you see, I was painting with some reflections because I like it, because in my mind works better than if I don't add them. If you think that you can add something, try, add something. If later you don't like it, you can remove it really quick with capibases. So don't feel afraid to painting something new like a sketch, because always I explain you that this one is a sketch. For sure, it's a sketch really well done, more or less should be finished. But in my opinion, if you think that always is a sketch, you can continue adding more information and you have your mind ready to change something if you need it. For example, now on that part of the crown, what happened with the colors that I'm using? I'm using in that case, instead of greens, as I use it in the other side, I'm using different kind of red. But in that case, really desaturated red. So it's like a gray with a bit of red color inside. Why I've decided to use that? The most interesting is the environment, always. In that side, in my opinion, should have more reddish tonalities. And because I'm going to use red everywhere in that side, the non-metallic should have exactly the same. So at the beginning, I'm going to use that kind of desaturated red. And then if I need more red, I'm going to increase the saturation later. But if you see, the saturation is really low. I don't want to use exactly the same saturation that I use on her chest, because the idea is try to represent the value or the powerful of this lighting. Is not the same. The lighting, the color, the powerful, the bright, near of the search of light than away of that. So here, because for me it's far away, I recommend you painting with grays and with a bit of color inside. More or less, this is the idea. How much near you're painting of the search of light, you can play just maybe with the color, the real color, the pure color, the most saturated color that you have on your mind. And then the other side, like there, I'm going to recommend you something desaturated. Always thinking about the tonalities, because if we remember, on the other side, I was painting with yellows or greens. When I'm talking about both, my opinion it's a kind of green, but it's depend of your screen or depend of the colors that are around that color could look more like a green or like a yellow. It's more or less between both. For me, it's like a really cold yellow, more like green, but for me, it will work like a cold yellow. So then in that area, instead of using the highest red or the highest saturation for the brights, I'm going to use, as I use on the other side when I was painting with green, I'm going to use desaturated gray colors for these highlightings. And the trick with the non-metallic metal, remember, always thinking how much contrast I can use, how much you can add will be better. Talking about the color, the contrast, the value, texture, everything that you can get, you will get better results. So once time I've painted all that side, it's time to paint that area of hair. This one, for me, it's, in my opinion, the area where you have to add more detail, more information, because the sculpting, it's so big and without enough information. But this is my opinion. So because that was on my mind, I've decided to add everything there with texture, with more contrast, with different tonalities, different shades, all of that on that area, and always talking about the desaturated colors. Because on the other side of that, I'm going to use saturated colors, more or less in the same way I use for her chest. Here, this is the effect that I recommend you to paint leather, just something like that. You can paint with other colors or the same, but the idea more or less is painting with a texture like this one, because will give you a feeling that this is older, not really new. This is what I thought, because if she is a vampire, I recommend you paint with really old materials. The armor, the same, so you will see how I add a lot of texture, but if you don't want, you can get something more polished and you will get something newer. My opinion, if everything looks new, will look fake. Just that. Because always we have everything new, but other areas will be older. And for her, if you want to get the feeling that she's a vampire and you want to represent that she's younger, I recommend you play with another contrast. Represent that her armor, it's older than her. Not older, but the feelings, you can understand me. So the armor, if you get the feeling that looks older, like she was fighting in battles or is from her grandfather or something like that, or grandmother, that kind of armor will give you the feeling that is older. And if she is a vampire, you can get the feeling with that kind of double contrast. Something really, really old visually, and the other one younger if we compare both. This is another kind of contrast. Always, if we play with different kind of contrast, we can get different information and something more interesting. When I said that interesting means that something that could keep me watching your miniature more time. For sure, you can paint with perfect blending, you can paint with beautiful colors, but then once time I watch it, it's like, okay, it's done. I don't have to watch anything else because yeah, you blend it really well, but just that. So this is something that I don't like to do. I like to add something else on my miniatures to keep you watching them more time. This is my idea, and this is how I feel that should be every kind of art, not just painting miniatures, but everything should hook you more time watching that. It's like in a movie. It's not the same a movie that you like it and you want to rewatch sometimes, or watching more time like, whoa, this was so short, or something that looks like, okay, so it was easy to watch and just that, no more time. So if you see in that way, I was painting everything with the base coat that I've painted with airbrush, and then I've decided to add texture with different values everywhere to represent the edge highlighting and that older feelings. At the beginning with a low contrast, because later I'm going to use exactly the same places, but not all of them, to repaint and add the feeling about this non-metallic metal. You will see how I use that kind of scratches that I added, all the damage, or every kind of detail to represent the non-metallic metal, instead of using the flat surfaces. In that case, I'm going to use the other way, using the details to represent the material instead of using the flat surfaces. On the flat surfaces, I'm going to add scratches, damage, and for sure, in that kind of information that I added, I'm going to reinforce them to get that feeling. For example, here you can see on her fingers how I'm repainting again the edge highlighting. Every time with a higher contrast, but in smaller areas. I don't want to repaint everything, because if I repaint everything, I'm going to remove the gradient that I've painted. If I keep that gradient with the next layers, I'm going to keep the gradient again. So I'm going to get more and more gradients and more highlightings. So what happened? That I'm going to get just with 5 layers, for example, a really nice highlighting with a nice gradient, and will be perfect to blend later with airbrush to increase the blending surface or smooth surfaces and more tonalities. As you see, I'm using, as always, my number 1 or number 2. These both are my favorite brushes, and I use them to paint everything. This is the other side. Again, I'm going to use more or less the effect that I use on her bra. What happened with that? My idea was exactly the same, using the colors that I used with my airbrush for the flat surfaces, and then use the edge highlighting to increase that effect. But in that case, instead of using black or different kind of grays, I'm going to use different kind of red, more saturated or brighter. Just that. That's the key. But more or less you will see how the effect is the same. So here you have the final of this video tutorial. I hope you have enjoyed watching this one. I hope I could bring you a different way to paint them with more colors, different expressions, and I hope you are ready to paint that model. Remember that I have the last video tutorial that I would like to keep all the secrets on this one to explore different ways and see the final result. So again, thank you very much for your huge support, and I hope continue surprising you. Bye bye.